Bueno, comenzamos, Angie, ¿te parece? Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, buenos días a todos. Hoy estamos reunidos para llevar adelante la defensa de tesis del profesor Ignacio Lau. En este momento se encuentran presentes acompañándonos, bueno, por supuesto, el tesista, los miembros del tribunal y la directora del tesista, Susana Compani, y desde lo tecnológico, Víctor Gómez, personal no docente, y desde lo académico administrativo, Ángela Castro. Bueno, les comento un poquito, la codirectora de la maestría, Susana Liruso, no ha podido unirse a la reunión por razones personales, así que voy a estar yo como representante de la carrera, y la secretaria de posgrado, la doctora Graciela Ferrero, se va a unir unos minutos más tarde, así que si ven que alguien aparece, es ella, que bueno, que nos va a acompañar, pero va a llegar un poquito más tarde. Algo también importante para decir es que debido a que este evento es singular, de alguna manera, considerando las defensas que se llevan adelante en la carrera, que son presenciales, gran parte del procedimiento lo voy a llevar adelante en español. Y bueno, vamos a comenzar entonces. Para acreditar identidad, yo les comenté que debían tener su DNI cerquita. Ah, bueno.
Yo tengo.
Bueno, entonces,
¿Lo mostramos ahora?
a medida que yo los voy nombrando, ustedes les pediría que lo mostraran. Bueno, a ver, Ignacio, si lo tenés ahí con vos.
Está perfecto.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Julia Martínez.
Está muy bien. Gracias.
Susana Ibáñez.
A ver, un poquito para arriba. Ahí está. Ahí está. Sí, gracias, profe.
Y Cecilia de la Vega.
Hay un poquito para arriba. Ahí está. Está perfecto.
Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, como yo les comenté entonces, ahora vamos a llevar adelante la defensa, le vamos a dejar la palabra a Ignacio, que más o menos en 45 minutos va a desarrollar los hallazgos principales de su investigación. El título del trabajo es Poesía de guerra malvinense, análisis comparativo desde los estudios del trauma, The Screaming in Silence de Tony McNally y Soldados de Gustavo Caso Rosendi. Entonces, en este momento, él va a tomar la palabra, nosotros vamos a silenciar nuestros micrófonos y una vez finalizada la defensa, vamos a proceder a las preguntas o apreciaciones que el tribunal pudiera formular. Ignacio, te damos la palabra entonces.
Bueno, presento, a ver, me dicen si ven la pantalla bien. A ver. ¿Se ve ahí?
Sí, se ve bien, Ignacio.
Perfect, all right, so I'm going to start. Well, okay, first of all, good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. My name is Ignacio Lau, and the title of my thesis is Malvinas War Poetry, a Comparative Approach to Tony McNally's Screaming in Silence, and Gustavo Caso Rosendi's Soldados from the perspective of trauma studies. So the general objective of this research is to analyze the representations of trauma in Malvinas War poetry produced by Tony McNally and Gustavo Caso Rosendi from the perspective of comparative literature and trauma studies. So I'm going to center on the most recurrent motifs and representations found in the text, which are basically connected to warfare and its devastating consequences for the participant. As regards the specific objectives, some of them, or the most important, are to analyze and compare the poetic representations of trauma in the corpus. As we will see, there are many different poetically coded symptoms that we can find or analyze or read in the text. Another specific objective is to contextualize the literary productions within the historical conflict of the War of Malvinas. This is also a very important factor when reading the text, and we will see that it's very much connected to trauma studies too. And the last one in this section is to determine which new values are assigned to the traumatic event, establish similarities, differences, and conclusions. The corpus in this case is made up by two poetry collections. The first one is Screaming in Silence, and it was published in 2016 by Tony McNally. Tony McNally was born in 1962. He's from England. He was born in Bury-in-Furness, and he is a Malvinas War veteran. And it's very maybe important to comment that in the prologue to his book, he says that all the poems in this collection have Malvinas as origin. So we know from the start that most of these literary productions has Malvinas War as a source, as a creative source. Well, maybe before going to Soldados, I think it's important to think about the title, Screaming in Silence, which is an oxymoron, right? And it already anticipates, in a way, the content of the poems, and something that is very much connected to trauma that we will see in a few minutes. The second poetry collection is called Soldados, published in 2009 by Gustavo Caso Rosendi. He's an Argentinian. He's also a Malvinas War veteran. He was also born in 1962 in Chubut, but now he lives in La Plata City. Something about Soldados that might be interesting is that it was published, well, in 2009, but with the help or promotion of the Ministry of Education and the government at the time. So besides being published as a book, there was also a booklet that you could download for free. And this information is relevant because in the booklet, we can find many different historical facts, events, extra information, even interviews. So this booklet was very important in connection to the research because it added extra information and interesting things in connection to the poems, how they were created. All right. The main hypothesis of this thesis is that the poetic trauma representations assign new values to the extreme experience that go beyond the traditional conception of trauma as an inaccessible event. So like I said before, I'm going to analyze the most recurrent themes found in the text from the perspective of trauma studies to see what new meanings are attributed to it. Well, this second hypothesis, approaching this literary text, could foster possible empathic responses as they position readers in situations analogous to those experienced by the poetic personas, has been discarded for the time being. Originally, I was interested in working with interviews, working with students, surveys, but because of time restriction and especially length restriction, I couldn't do it. So again, this hypothesis has been discarded, but it has been included in the future studies section that we will see at the end, probably. Okay, so the theoretical framework for this thesis is twofold. The first field is the one of comparative literature, which is an interdisciplinary field that studies literary phenomena across national boundaries. This is a very simple definition, right? But comparative literature is basically, I would say, the reciprocal study between two forms of writing. And I'm going to quote Hutchinson. Comparative literature constitutes an indiscipline, a self-reflexive mode of reading rather than an object of study, or perhaps a self-reflective mode of reading in search of an object of study. I really like this quote and idea because I think that, and it's very much connected to the fact of comparative literature being also, or about constructing metaphors of reading, about constructing or finding the ways of approaching a text and how you read it. And so it is very much connected to techniques, to methods, and that's why connected to the field is the comparative method that was used in this case. And it is called the method-driven approach, also proposed by Hutchinson. Basically, in this model, the critic identifies an argument and prosecutes it from a particular perspective. This means that an argument would be basically my main idea, what I want to prove, my hypothesis, which is warfare and the consequences it has on the subject in connection to trauma. And the particular perspective is trauma studies. It is basically the theoretical lens that I use in order to read the corpus. And very much connected to the methodology also is the one of comparative close reading. I'm sure that most of you remember close reading because it's a very old technique, let's say, and methodology, which in a way focuses on scrutinizing the text and find all the different inner patterns in order to reach a full and deep understanding of the text, which in this case is connected to using that methodology, but applying the techniques of it in order to examine two texts, which in this case, well, of course, we are talking about comparative literature, mainly because we are reading and analyzing two different authors from different countries and who speak different languages and who were even enemies within the context of the Malvinas War. So it's very important to think about these issues as well. Okay, the second theoretical framework is the one connected to trauma studies. And it's important to say that it's an interdisciplinary area that basically borrows or mostly borrows from psychology and Freudian tenets, but it can also be complemented by cultural studies, feminism, post-colonial studies, or anything else that you might want to choose in order to structure the way you analyze the texts. But in short, it explores the impact of trauma in literature and society, analyzing its main psychological, cultural, and rhetorical significance. So in a way, trauma studies focuses on how language structures or tries to structure a traumatic event and how the subject perceives this event and tries to reenact it, relive it. A very important concept in connected to trauma studies is obviously trauma. In the past, or let's say originally, trauma was used to talk about a physical wound, something that was somehow observable, that you could actually see on the body, outside the body. But nowadays, trauma is used to talk about a pathological, mental, and emotional condition, an injury to the psyche caused by catastrophic events or by the threat of such events, which overwhelm an individual's normal response mechanism. I quoted Kurtz. Something important about trauma is that it has different dimensions when we talk about it. It can be individual, collective, of natural causes, or human-made even. If we think about, let's say, a case of maybe sexual abuse, we're talking about an individual instance of trauma perpetuated by another person. But there are instances, for example, maybe if we think about an earthquake, tidal waves, well, these catastrophic events were caused by outside elements connected to nature. So they are different. But in this case, we are actually talking about a human effort, which is warfare. It is basically the result of human actions. And it's also a collective account of trauma because it involves the community, not only the soldiers, but the civilians, everybody connected to it in that way. Okay, so The field of trauma studies began in the 1990s, especially with the publication of seminal works by Kathy Caruth and Kali Tal. And the main ideas behind this traditional model were basically that trauma is a severely disruptive event of the unconscious that has no resolution. This is the important part, that it has no resolution. You cannot account for what happened during that time. And as we will see, this is something that changes in newer or revised models. Memory in this case is seen as a storehouse. And this means that memory is somehow frozen in a timeless state. And as a result, you cannot access it and you cannot retrieve it. It's completely static. As regard language here, linguistic representation is highly limited for this traditional model because there's a sort of gap in memory and you cannot recreate that. So for this model, trauma fragments the psyche and alters identity. And they basically regard trauma as something universal that you can attribute to biological elements only. And so the main idea or main conclusion behind this model is that trauma is unrepresentable and unclaimed, something very strong. After several years, especially during the past decade, right, there was a new model called pluralistic. And this is a revised model, an updated model that basically regards trauma as a multi-causal event. Here now trauma now is basically complex, and it includes many internal as well as external factors. And that's why for the pluralistic model, the socio-cultural context is so relevant, because in a way it proves and shows that trauma occurs in specific bodies, it occurs in specific places, at specific times. For this paradigm, memory is seen as a fluid process of reconstruction. This means that we are not talking about a frozen past anymore, but this is something dynamic that changes. And when you go back to the past, you can reconfigure it. Now, in connection to language, even though there is a gap in memory and meaning is lost or fragmented, linguistic potential is possible. And we will see this in connection to my thesis. So the main idea behind the pluralistic model is to go beyond the trope of unspeakability, which was something that was very dominant in the past 20 years, in order to find new meanings and determinate values attributed to the traumatic event. So in this case, the conclusion would be that new knowledge is formed about the self and the external world when you are dealing with traumatic events. Before going to the analysis of the corpus per se, I wanted to talk about the category of reader I had in mind when analyzing the text, which are terms introduced by Wolfgang Iser from Reader to Respond Criticism. The categories are the one of the implied and actual reader. In the case of the implied reader, we know that he's some sort of model that can be passive or active, but he's expected to respond in certain ways. In a way, the text structures his or her responses, but he also constructs meaning, right? And the second one, the actual reader, is an individual reader who brings his or her own personal experience to the text. Even though the text produces images, these images are modified by this reader who is all the time introducing things connected to his own personal background. The important thing about these two readers is that obviously they are hypothetical and that they are the same, they coexist, and they respond in different ways and at different levels. So that's why I had this category of reader in mind. And I'm going to quote Abrams: as a consequence, literary texts always permit a varied range of possible meanings. Especially with poetry, I think meaning is open-ended. The reader always brings something new to the text, which was at least my experience when analyzing the corpus. So the main analysis of the corpus has been carried out in two different moments. The first one, is representations of trauma on the battlefield, and then representations of trauma in the aftermath of war. So, on the first moment of analysis, we basically see poems where the poetic persona is located on a constructed scenario of combat, most of the times. But here we are going to read poems that deal with the life of the soldier during battle. Maybe he's preparing for war, for combat. Maybe he is during a fight in a combat trying to confront the enemy. And there are other instances where he's even sharing time with fellow soldiers. So during this moment of analysis, the main stressors that had been identified in the text are connected to elements of unpredictability and chance. Because basically during war times, the soldiers, the personas, have no control over the bullets and the shell fragments. They are all the time under constant threat. So they can die at any time. And it is something that, in a way, disorders the psyche, because it's a very thin line to cross. And sometimes this is also represented in poems that deal with this ethical dilemma of kill or die, right? If I don't kill my enemy, he will kill me. So it's kind of like a very extreme dilemma, but it was also present in some of the poems. These issues, let's say, can be analyzed in this question, or this idea, basically, of having a pre-war identity clashing with the war identity. This means that previous to going to combat, you had a certain identity, typically more connected to civilian life and doing things everyday life. And when you go to war, you need to forge a new identity. And sometimes the persona might not be able to adapt to it. And as a response, as a consequence, it might develop possible traumatic responses, as we will see. So the analysis of the corpus has shown that the persona adapts certain strategies to cope with trauma during these times, which are divided here as immature or mature defense mechanisms. Even though this is a two-entry table, there might be others in the middle, but just for the sake of organization and time, I have done it in this way. And let's go to analyze maybe a few immature defense mechanisms. I have found or discovered some related to passivity and dissociation, where the soldier persona cannot react and cannot act. For example, there's a poem where he's in the middle of a bombardment, but it's also snowing. So he mixes the snowflakes with the bombs and cannot distinguish one or the other, which is something obviously very dangerous to do during a combat. Another strategy is the one of womb fantasy, which is basically a regressive fantasy of going to the maternal womb, which is most of the time represented in symbolic forms like existing underwater, living alone in a cave, being in fetal position. And in this case, there's a poem by McNally where the soldier is in the middle of a battle and everything is very extreme, and he cannot cope anymore with what is going on, and he had enough. So he crawls and starts to go back into his sleeping bag. And he wants to go there and sleep forever, and he doesn't want anybody else to bother him. So in a way, he's also, this is in a way connected also to regression. He's going back to a childlike state. There are points where he even says, he starts to use terms connected to childish language, like "Mommy, I miss you," "Mommy, I want to be with you," "Mommy, rescue me," and even wetting himself. Well, let's go to some of the mature defense mechanisms found in the corpus when analyzed through the lens of trauma studies. The first one is connected to resilience, which is the capacity in a way or flexibility in order to adapt to new situations and be successful at doing so. So there are some poems that show this. The soldier resisting his environment and the harsh context of warfare. There are other mature defense mechanisms like humor, jokes, sarcasm, and the use of irony, which are of course mature because you're in a way dealing with something that is very serious, like death and war, but you can make jokes about it, and it is considered mature for that, for those reasons. And the last, which is I think the most important, is the one of camaraderie. Camaraderie is very much connected to poems where we can observe the soldier portrayed as sharing a meal with other fellow soldiers, having a smoke, talking about relationships, making jokes. The element of camaraderie and companionship are very important in the context of war because it allows for greater social cohesion and unit cohesion because it creates basically stronger safety nets and supportive relationships, which is something you really want in militia, because sometimes even the soldiers find new families, new brothers in that context. They are very much, they are even able to risk their own lives for their brothers in arms. So the main conclusion after analyzing trauma at this stage is that it is in embryo. This means that trauma is in a dormant state. It is sleeping, ready to develop. And that's why, and I'm going to quote Forter, trauma is an event so overwhelming and inassimilable that the self responds by absenting itself from direct experience of the event. And this is maybe the interesting part about trauma. The self responds by absenting itself from direct experience. This means that during the time of the brutalizing event, the ego is trying to protect itself at all costs. And that's why it is going to absent itself in order to prevent further harm. And that's why the metaphor of the chrysalid is so important at this stage. And by the way, this is actually a metaphor used by Tony McNally in one of his poems, where he says that he wants to go back into his green sleeping bag, the same sleeping bag we talked about. And he says, I want to go back to my green pupa, my green chrysalid. So in a way, trauma is basically dormant in a state of development, waiting in order to grow. Okay, the second moment of analysis are representations of trauma in the aftermath of war. In this case, there is a marked tendency to show the soldier after the war, typically many years after the war, trying to adapt back to civilian life, and showing that it is almost impossible to do so. And we get to see all the different challenges he has to endure and all the problems he faces. And I'm going to quote Forter again. Traumatic responses are inactive, and the representations of trauma through poetry suggest the transmission of a latent traumatogenic significance, an uncomprehended meaning that will lie dormant within the soldier until a second event retrospectively determines its effect. And again, the focus here is basically the second event that retrospectively determines the effects of the trauma. This is how trauma works, in a way. So the past and the present motif is basically the most important one. You can always read poems connected to how the past is interrupting the present to cause hurt or to do something else, as we will see. And so it is during this stage that trauma is at full potential. very much connected to this idea of the waiting period that we have. It's the concept of afterwardsness, which is the wound inflicted by a particular traumatic event remains latent for a determined period of time and then emerges primarily as repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion is basically the unconscious desire or need to go back to the brutalizing event in order to master it, in order to conquer it, right? And this is what we see in all of these poems, or this set of poems. And that's why there's always, I'm quoting Kurtz, there is something in trauma that intrinsically evokes a beyond. That beyond is the one captured in the term post, in post-traumatic stress disorders, as we will soon see. So if we take a look at this simple diagram, in a way, we can see how trauma develops and operates, within the context of the corpus at least. Well, I'm going to quote an excerpt from my thesis, which is very short. The past and the present motif permeates the literary productions. The traumatic event serves as a launch pad for the individual's future responses by establishing the severed link between the past and the present self. Its origin to the unspeakability such work of trauma studies. In this case, if we take a look up on the left side of the slide, we see the traumatic event, the origin. And after it, we have this period of dormancy where everything appears to be well, right? But after a certain period of time, we have the first traumatic responses, which in the context of the corpus develop into PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. And just in case you don't know the term, PTSD is a disorder that may result when an individual lives through or witnesses an event in which he or she believes that there is a threat to life or physical integrity and safety, and experiences fear, terror, or helplessness. PTSD is basically a clinical category that was introduced in 1990 and in a way it replaced other nomenclatures that were inadequate to express what happened with soldiers after war. Terms like shell shock, terms like hysterical orders of warfare, war neurosis, and others. So concept and term is very important for us because it includes so different kinds of symptoms and experiences. And even if we take a look at this word cloud here, we realize that PTSD is a very complex term because it comprises different symptoms, different conditions, different disorders that are put together in this very broad term, kind of like an umbrella term in a way. And that is why it was so relevant for the present thesis, because it was very rich as a theoretical construct. And at the same time, it showed that trauma is something that cannot be attributed to a few elements only, and that also trauma differs from person to person. That's why PTSD was basically an organizing concept behind the analysis. And again, it shows that the different conditions of trauma are better represented as a spectrum, not just like maybe binary conditions or term like good, bad. So during this moment of analysis, what was done basically was to analyze poetically coded symptoms. So the first ones that were the most salient, or the ones that were very observable first, is the one connected to repetition called compulsion. Again, the idea of going back to the repressed prototype, what happened in the past during the war. And we get to see this repetition compulsion mainly through different flashbacks, intrusive images, painful recollections, nightmares, which in a way summarizes, right, the theme of the past and the present once more. It's connected to this idea. Another symptom observed was survivor's guilt. which basically is the feeling of remorse or guilt for having survived a catastrophic event when others did not, or maybe for not having suffered pain like others did. So survivor's guilt is very common in militia, specifically because it stems from this idea of not having done enough in order to protect others, which is a basic element during combat. So the question I was able to observe or analyze or read this in the corpus, because there were instances where the persona asked, like, why me? Why am I alive? Right? Why did he die? Why did my fellow soldier die and not me? Then, well, there are other instances where the persona is seen to, in some sort of detachment from social interactions. He isolates himself. He starts to drink more alcohol, to take pills, which do not help at all. He's in a very bad place with negative thoughts and depression, and he's even contemplated suicide, and even actual suicide. There is a poem by Gustavo Caso Rosendi called El Último Enemigo that tells the story of Jorge, a soldier that after the war, many years after the war, decides to die by committing suicide. So it's a very serious issue within the context of the corpus. The analysis of during this stage has also shown basically that there are many different ways the poet is trying to deal with his trauma. And I'm going to read the first part. Confronting the horrific past by facing it linguistically is already a process that entails profound reconfiguration, as coding the traumatic event into poetic representations enables the persona to elucidate ways of claiming that which was unspeakable or irretrievable. This idea is important because it's already anticipating my conclusions. And during this stage, I have found poems that do not only break with the silence and reclaim the past, but also poems that, for example, criticize politicians and their role in promoting warfare. They openly question them, like, you are the ones who make the choices, you give orders, but I go to war and die, and you get to stay in your houses doing nothing. So it's very open criticism, very ironic and sarcastic in many of the poems. Then the poems about suicide also help to raise awareness about the issue, because it shows that many soldiers die after the war in their safety of their houses, let's say, but they are not actually safe from trauma. There are poems that also deal with homelessness, especially I would say McNally. He has many poems that deal with homeless veterans, showing that they weren't able to adapt into civilian life and end up on the street in a state of vulnerability. Sometimes even healthcare is questioned. Doctors, how they treat veterans and the medicine they give them that does not help. One last dimension is connected to memory and how important it is in order to honor and remember the soldiers and to give them voice, because they are not here with us anymore. So the main conclusions found after analyzing the corpus using the theoretical frameworks of comparative literature and trauma studies have shown that basically the first hypothesis that I mentioned has been confirmed, as the poetic representations of war trauma in Soldados and Screaming in Silence, assign new values to the extreme event and revisit the figure of the soldier veteran, reconstructing and redirecting the traumatic impulses into new possibilities. As we have seen after talking about the different moments of analysis, the soldier during war and then the soldier or the veteran after the war, we can say that they are constructed in places of constant change, where they want to go back to the past in order to reconfigure it, in order to challenge it challenge what was going on and to master it in a way. And also we get to see poems where they are very critical about the warfare, its origin, things connected to politicians, and also even civilian people who support the war. There is a poem by Gustavo Caso Rosendi where he even questions the role of the media. In a very sarcastic way, he talks about Revista Gente at the time. And of course, one of the new possibilities also of redirecting the trauma is this idea of paying homage to fallen soldiers, which is something that is very common and pervasive in war poetry, remembering the fallen ones. So in a way, this group of poems are very much connected to the role of memory, the importance of memory, and also connected to their own personal rights of remembrance, in a way. Well, the analysis of the corpus has also shown that the socio-cultural context is very important in connection to reading these texts through the lens of trauma studies. And this is basically so because war is a collective effort, something that affects the whole community. And that's why there are so many references and intertextual figures that talk about what was going on at the time. For example, there are poems that deal with battles that took place. So they actually name the battles during the war. Then there are many references to geographical names on the island and outside of it too. There are even reference to famous people, even national artists. In the case of Argentina, Charly Garcia, Luis Alberto Spinetta. There's also a reference to the Beatles from England. So a study that takes into account the social cultural context is paramount when reading these kinds of texts, because again, it creates a sort of dialogue. The references are better understood and complement the readings. Another element also connected to the social cultural context is the one of the biographical information that was available. Like I mentioned before, in the case of Soldado, it was published with this booklet that is full of interviews and even interviews that deal with the creative impulses behind Gustavo Rosendi's creations, what he had in mind and why he chose maybe a certain image and not another in order to talk about the war and this specific soldier. There's information, for example, connected to real soldiers. So I don't know if you remember the poem I mentioned about Jorge committing suicide. Well, in the interviews, you read that it was Jorge Martí who was a friend of Caso Rosendi. So he's even given a last name. And I think that this adds a new layer of meaning to the text, a different perspective. In the same way, Tony McNally also includes a lot of information in his prologue, and he talks about his experience of going to the war, several other issues that contributed to his current state because he was diagnosed with PTSD, and how he started to write in order to get better, as we will see soon. So this is very much connected, all these issues that I have been discussing, connected to the idea of literature as a bridge between cultures, as a connection. And of course, this is linked to the field of comparative literature. And it was a conclusion that was arrived to because of the comparative analysis. It shows basically that nobody wins in war. There are no victors. Only pain and suffering from the ones who participated. So that's why I think comparing these two different set of poems that belong to opposing countries, let's say, or nations within the context of the war was incredibly relevant, was a very enriching experience. And again, those ideas permeate the text. They are present in most of them. Well, this quote in a way summarizes what I said, and so I'm going to read it, and it's by Hutchinson. To look at literature comparatively is to realize just how much can be learned by looking over the horizon of one's own tradition. It is to discover more not only about other literatures, but also about one's own. And it is to participate in a great utopian dream of understanding the way cultures interact. Another conclusion that was possible to elucidate at the end after the analysis is also that connected to the fact, let's say, that there's a layer of denunciation through the texts, because in most of them, the poets basically reject pro-war propaganda and blatantly criticize the people who promote it. So the corpus, in a way, can be read as an act of resistance at the very heart of warfare, an act of reclaiming and transforming the traumatic past. And I really like this quote by Bayer, because that's what I had in mind when analyzing the text. And it's very clear that the personas, the soldiers, the veterans are all the time trying to fight back and resist. They don't want to, in a way, give in to their traumatic responses and just be in a state of constant hurt. They want to do something about it and being proactive. So very much connected to this also is memory again. And here we can stress the importance of memory in connection to healing. When we talk about communal healing, memory is obviously very important, because we engage in a set of actions and ideas and discourses that explain what happened at the time, and also explain in a way what is going on now in the present. Why are these soldiers suffering so much? What are these soldiers suffering from PTSD? What is the connection there? So in that sense, and quoting Michel Balaïv, trauma's meaning is locatable rather than permanently lost. So in that sense, we can talk about poetry as having this socially utilitarian use, because in a way, you can regard the poet here as a preserver of memories. Poetry maybe as testimony. All right, another conclusion or finding is connected to the idea of poetry as a genre and its potential to represent and to code traumatic events into language. So I think this is very much connected to devices and stylistic resources, typically from the genre, right? Like metaphors, symbols, similes, rhyming structures and patterns, and many others. In my experience, they are very effective in portraying traumatic situations. And in a way, the literary resources also can be read as mature defense mechanism within the context of the corpus, obviously. And this idea maybe can be connected to the one I mentioned. The one about Tony McNally being diagnosed with PTSD. After being diagnosed by a doctor, he was advised to write poetry in order to explore his feelings. So in this way, we can connect or link this idea to poetry therapy, which is a kind of scriptotherapy, basically writing with therapeutic purposes, right? Trying to express your feelings in order to allow for personal growth and healing as well. In this way, we can maybe discuss the issue of trauma narratives and trauma poetics, because for the most part, trauma theorists, trauma theory scholars had focused on analyzing fiction, novels. They tend to deal with narrators, characters, plot, timelines, and other elements. but I strongly believe that we can also talk about trauma poetics. And I'm going to read a quote by Zoe Norwich, that says, literary texts are uniquely placed to represent pain because they excel in the creation of new systems of meaning, vocabularies, grammars, and image libraries of emotion. And this is, I think, very much connected to what poetry, or the role of poetry within this context. All right, to finish, I'm very much connected to the previous idea of trauma poetics. I think that areas of possible research and study are precisely connected to trauma poetics, because I think that a more exhaustive, detailed analysis of the stylistic resources could be carried out, maybe by analyzing more on what figures of speech or rhetorical devices are better or more suitable in order to represent trauma, right? Maybe metaphors, maybe oxymorons, because they have in them this sort of contradiction, right? The thing about hating the past but going back to it anyway. Well, very much connected to the title of Tony McNally's book, right? Screaming in Silence. So I think that would be a very good and interesting area to explore. Well, future research, could also explore basically the relationship between the reader and the ethical implications when engaging in trauma texts. And this kind of analysis, I know it's a completely different analysis, and it takes a different methodological and theoretical approach, which basically can borrow from empathy studies, affect theory, reader response criticism, which are areas that borrow from psychology. Maybe we think about empathy studies, social and cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and then, for example, areas related to ethics, philosophy, and so on. So I believe it's an area that is very interesting, connected very much to this idea of what happens when somebody reads these kinds of texts, right? But again, it's a completely different thesis, let's say. All right, to finish, I would like to read this quote by Martín Raniqueo, who is also a Malvinas War veteran and a friend of Gustavo Caso Rosendi. I think this quote, in a way, summarizes many of the issues that I have discussed and analyzed in my thesis, especially the one connected to language and also the power of language to reclaim that silence, to break that silence. Sorry. Malvinas no fue un tema que Gustavo abordara en sus comienzos como poeta. Probablemente el poeta ya intuía que no se escribe con el dolor, sino con su recuerdo mismo. Ese dejar de cantar el tema, esa distancia en el tiempo hasta llegar a Soldados, le permitió transformar un hecho doloroso en un hecho estético, para decirnos que, tal vez, se escriba porque se ha perdido una experiencia inefable, y al escribirla, se realiza una experiencia del lenguaje. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio. Te aplaudimos a la distancia.
Bueno, gracias.
Bueno, ahora podés relajarte un poco y bueno, los miembros del jurado van a tener la palabra una vez por una cuestión organizativa, como para dar una apreciación general si quisieran o formular alguna pregunta que les haya quedado en carpeta para formular ahora en este momento. Bueno, como yo les mandé en el mail, vamos a comenzar, si les parece, con Julia Martínez. Una vez terminada la participación de Julia, seguiremos con Cecilia de la Vega y finalmente con la profesora Susana Ibáñez. Así que, bueno, les doy la palabra también para que ustedes prosigan. Julia.
Gracias. Hago una consulta, dada la singularidad del evento.
En inglés.
Okay. Okay, Ignacio. Once again, congratulations on your work. I think that your research is very thorough, very detailed. It shows comprehensive study of the two collections of poems that you chose. And it was very easy to read, interesting to read. The conclusions that you arrived at were very well summarized in your presentation today. And I think that this research is very valuable, not only for the academic community, as I said in my evaluation, let's say, but also for the general community, because Malvinas is a topic that is part of our own history as citizens of Argentina and as citizens of the world, okay? So I am very happy with the results, okay? During your presentation, I was also glad to hear and see that you decided to discard the second hypothesis because it was a concern, a great concern that I had when I read the written version of your research, because there was no way you were going to prove that with what you had done, okay? That implied, as you have very well said, a completely different approach, even a new study, because you would need to work not only with texts as you did, but also with subjects, with people, with the real readers to see how they would react to this type of poetry. So I'm glad that you decided to discard it. And I think that your suggestion of including this hypothesis as part of future research within the framework of empathy studies or affect theories or even reader response criticism is very valuable, okay? So I also value your reconsideration, okay? I have no further comments. Again, I think that you have done a very good job. And as Florencia told you a moment ago, you can now relax. You have reached this stage. Your presentation was very good. Again, easy to follow. The most important pieces of information were very well summarized. So congratulations again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Now it's Cecilia's turn. Would you like to say something?
Yes. Okay, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Ignacio as well. It was a great presentation and you did a very good job. Which I found most interesting of your research was your decision of studying poetry instead of narrative, okay? Because that is kind of innovative in Malvinas topic. And I found such a potential in poetry because it's not only what you can read as you did, that you found the trauma in poetry represented, but it's also what poetry enables the former soldier, because writing poetry in itself is a defense mechanism. And I found that so strong because they are dealing with their post-traumatic stress by writing those poems. So it's a very complex corpus to analyze because you are analyzing the representations, but the poetry in itself is a defense mechanism. So I found that very, very interesting. And as you said in your conclusions, it would be very interesting to go further into traumatic poetry or poetics, okay, metaphors, similes, oxymorons, and to see if both poets use the same resources or not. Or maybe what I would go deep into is conceptual metaphors, okay? that is so strong in that type of text. So I really liked your thesis, your work. I enjoyed reading it. I have a very strong connection with Malvinas because I'm from Patagonia, so I saw the soldiers. I remember the troops. I remember everything from Malvinas. So for me, it was very moving to read your job. So congratulations again. And I'm very happy to be here and to share this opportunity with you.
Thank you for sharing your personal story too, connected to Malvinas. And what you said is very much true. When I started to read trauma studies as a discipline, most of the text and bibliography center on fiction. So I had to do like a different kind of approach to the poems. It was very challenging, but I really enjoyed it because of the things you mentioned. Poems have somehow, I don't know, like an endless potential to represent something and embed so much meaning into a metaphor that somehow you have to explain that in paragraphs in novels, let's say. But here with a metaphor or a symbol, you can read so many different things. So it was an interesting experience, though very challenging. So thanks.
You're welcome. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Last but not least, Susana's turn.
Hi everybody. It's been an honor to read your work. I really enjoyed the text. I value that highly because sometimes theses are quite difficult to get through as texts. They are supposed to be highly packed, and your text was a pleasure to read. So I congratulate you on that. Also on the fact that you took up the glove here and tackled a very difficult topic, because first of all, working with poetry is difficult itself, and then building a corpus that is so challenging as this one is also really something to value in your career as a researcher. In my feedback, I drew your attention to the category of reader, because I also noticed the same Julia noticed regarding the second objective. And not only that, but also the way in which you referred to readers along the text. When you use the word, sometimes you refer to the audience, sometimes you refer to you yourself as a reader. And then without being so specific as to the second objective, I wanted you to rethink that in particular. So I appreciate the fact that you addressed the issue in your presentation. And I also think that working with readers is a completely different work. It's a different, a new thesis that you may work with, and it implies a completely different theoretical construction. So I think that it would be a great follow-up if you intended to continue with the work, with this research work. So my congratulations again. I hope you go on along this line of study, and I can, in a way, forecast a great researcher career.
Well, thank you, Ms. Ibanez. Connected to what you said, and also what Ms. Martinez said at the beginning, I think this has a great potential in the community, especially with students, right? And I had been teaching Malvinas poetry for the last few years, and that's why I think I was so much interested in analyzing what was going on with the reader, right? Because I see that with my students in an informal way, because I'm not using tools from reader response criticism or affect theory. But yeah, definitely it's an area of future research that I would like to explore, definitely, yeah. And I like poetry, so it's a win-win.
Good.
Yeah, I know it's strange sometimes, but I think it's really good, so I enjoy it. Thank you for your comments and observations. They were very helpful, and they gave me different readings and new perspectives. So thank you very much for reading my work and taking the time to make such relevant comments. Thanks.
Thanks to you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Entonces, ahora vamos a proseguir con el siguiente paso. Lo que vamos a hacer es excepto los miembros del tribunal, todo el resto nos vamos a retirar de esta reunión. Yo he compartido una carpeta con ustedes a sus mails. Ahí tienen los 3 informes que ustedes han confeccionado y también un esqueleto, digamos, del dictamen final. Entonces, nosotros vamos a dejar de grabar la reunión, nosotros nos vamos a retirar y yo les voy a dejar mi teléfono celular. Julia o Ceci, alguna de las dos, una vez que terminen el dictamen y lo tengan listo, me pueden mandar a mí un mensaje y yo me comunico con el resto para que nos volvamos a reunir acá y podamos leer en voz alta el dictamen final. ¿Sí?
Vale.
De acuerdo.
Vamos a dejar de